Good afternoon, everyone. The Bribery Act. Paul's asked me to sort of confine what I talk about to adequate procedures. I know Neil later is going to cover some of the law in more detail. So adequate procedures in the Bribery Act. GT did a survey earlier this year in April asking FTSE 350 companies what they thought about the Bribery Act. And we've got some very interesting responses. 20% of people didn't think anything about the Bribery Act, never heard of it, which April this year, that's quite a staggering finding. The report's on the website. It's quite a useful document. It sort of points out that lots of people are aware of it but haven't done anything, and they've been spending the year learning about the Bribery Act and deciding what they're going to do. But the key finding that came out of that report was the Bribery Act is unfair. Everyone said, this can't be right, this is unworkable. It's all your fault, you're telling me about this Bribery Act, it's not right. Well, we're not telling you about, we're not setting the law, we're just telling you about what it says. And yes, it is difficult. I'm not sure it's impossible, but it is difficult. And we're going to look at some of the ways that you can deal with that difficulty as we go through this afternoon. So, where are we at the moment? The law got assent in April. The offences are due to come into force next April, so we've got a little bit of a window. It sets a gold standard. It is the most challenging of all the anti-bribery laws. It's even in advance of the FCPA, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. The interesting thing for me, I think, will be how it's enforced, and I think Neil may cover some of that a bit later. As part of doing our survey document, we spoke to lots of people. This chap, Vivian Robinson QC, is the General Counsel at the SFA. He gets to make the ultimate decision on a lot of cases about whether or not to prosecute. And I think this sets out really one of the key things, the tone at the top. You've got to have anti-corruption procedures discussed at board level. He made it very clear, every board, not just large companies, every board should have this as a standing item on their agenda. Then perhaps a bit more robustly, Colin Cowan, I don't know if anyone's met him, he was the DCI in charge of the Overseas Anti-Corruption Unit of the London Police. He said, people who don't think bribery and corruption is high risk have their head in the sand, which I think was a rather more robust statement. But I think for me, those two quotes actually encapsulate what the Bribery Act's about. It's about ensuring you have buy-in from the top, sending a statement that bribery isn't acceptable. And then it's about identifying what your risks are. What are the risks in your business, and then doing something about them. But why have adequate procedures? Well, if you don't, and you fall foul of a corporate offence, the penalties are fairly severe. Unlimited fines for corporates. Unlimited. That could be a very, very large number indeed. As we've seen from BAE, 30 million. That's a big number, but in the context of BAE, perhaps not as large as it could have been. Reputational damage. Who wants to be in the newspapers? The red top test. Do you want to appear in the mirror as your company accused of bribery? Having a monitor imposed on you. That's a guy that sits in your business that you have to put all your key business decisions through to make sure they're ethical. Who would want that? How agile could your businesses be if that was imposed upon you? POCA. What happens if you've won a contract because somebody in your organisation has bribed somebody? Is that whole contract the proceeds of crime? Are they going to come after the whole value of it, even if you only made 1 or 2%? So, as I said at the outset, a lot of people think the Act's unfair, the penalties are enormous. What can you do about it? Well, we've got some draft guidance that's come out from the MOJ. But what does it say? There's going to be some final guidance issued in January next year. But the draft is quite interesting. It says it doesn't actually have to be applied. It's just guidance. It doesn't supersede or replace any of the other guidance that already exists. They noted the intention was to support businesses in designing the kinds of measures they might put in place to prevent bribery. They said it's to complement. It's not to replace. So, what are the other sources? Well, I put up some sources on there that exist. One that I didn't put on there, which is quite interesting, is the World Bank Institute publishes something called Fighting Corruption Through Collective Action. And that's where very large corporates get together and they agree that if they're bidding for a large contract somewhere in the world, they won't do so without the other members being present, and they ensure that they have some sort of social monitor there to make sure that there's no allegations of Enterprise Act type offences, so there's no cartel type arrangements. But that's certainly quite an interesting approach. And I think perhaps what it shows is the Bribery Act is driving businesses to do things differently. They're looking for different ways to achieve their aims. So what does the draft guidance that we currently have show? We've interpreted it and produced this lovely graphic. I hope you can read it. The colours have sort of blurred some of it out a bit. The first thing is, the guidance that's out there, it's not prescriptive. It says clearly in the text, it is not meant to be, follow this and this is the way it will work. It's a set of principles. And like anything that's principles-based, it's down to us to interpret how to apply those principles to our business. It also makes it clear that what's appropriate for a large business might not be appropriate for a smaller business. So it's about making sure that what you have in place is proportionate to the risks that you face and the scale of your business and where you do business. It's drawn as a cycle deliberately. This is not something that you do once and then just walk away from it. This is something that you put in place now and you review how it's working and you develop a feedback loop. You know, the guidance says that we ought to be monitoring the effectiveness. That implies that you will see how your policies are working and feedback round into making sure that they are effective going forward. What's the frequency of that? It's a bit unclear. I mean, is it annually? Is it biannually? I think, again, that's for individual companies to decide, given the status of what they do and the markets in which they operate in. I think it's not really rocket science. There's nothing on here that's new or different or complicated. And one of the things that we've been finding talking to clients is they say, well, we just don't know what's going to come out. Well, this is fairly predictable, I think. Waiting until January for a revised version may not be the appropriate way forward. So let's have a look at some of the individual elements. Knowledge. I think the key for any adequate procedures framework is you've got to understand the risks that your business face. If you haven't got that understanding about what it is you do and the markets in which you operate, where you touch things like the public sector, where do you touch the use of agents, where do you have suppliers that perhaps also face those sorts of issues? If you haven't mapped those out, how can you possibly go about putting in place procedures designed to prevent bribery? The next bit of knowledge is due diligence. How do you know who you do business with? Not always easy to do. You might know who you do business with today. What about next year or the year after? We've come across quite a few instances where the file on the due diligence was done this year, and when you look at it, you find they hadn't done any for 10 years previously. And at the time that they entered into that contract with that particular individual, they were working for somebody completely different. And they get very surprised when they now find that it's a competitor that's employing their agent. But the Bribery Act has driven this desire to look at who they're doing business with. Culture. We talked about top-level commitment, but what does that mean? I was at a FTSE 100 company the other day, and they introduced me to their Bribery Act champion. Very nice lady. She's a trainee. She'd been in the business 4 weeks. They'd landed that on her and said, here you go, read this, put in place some adequate procedures. Now, I really don't think if the SFO knock on their door, they're going to be able to say we had the right tone at the top. The best will in the world, and I'm sure she will do a great job. She just will not have the buy-in to get that moving. It's going to be very hard to persuade companies to move in this direction. I think the attitude of a lot of people will be, why do I need to do this? So you need someone fairly senior to encourage and motivate people down the chain to get things moving. Policies and procedures. Well, I think Martin's going to talk about what good policies and what good procedures look like. But I think it's important that they're specific to your risks. There is some great guidance out there. Transparency International publishes a great document. If you read the Wolf Report for the defence industry, again, a great document. But they're specific to various industries. And I think you need to find exactly what's appropriate for you. And that will be different, maybe even within your business. And it could be acceptable to have a £250 gift limit in the UK, or hospitality limit. Is it appropriate to have that limit when you're working in Indonesia, where it might buy you rather more? Perhaps not. So you've got to look quite carefully where you're doing business and what those policies should be. It's not really good enough just to have a bunch of policies on your intranet. It's all about how you roll those out through an organisation. And I think probably those people in this room have done that in a number of different things. It's not easy. Some of the things you've got to do, how are you going to record what you've done? How are you going to make sure that if someone were to knock on the door, you can demonstrate how you rolled those policies out? How are you going to show that Mr. Blogs in Indonesia was trained on what's acceptable? You might have a document that says, oh, we emailed it to everyone. Well, how do you prove that they looked at it, read it, and understand it? Do you need to? At the moment, we're not really sure. How widely are you going to implement your policies? Do you go down your supply chain? Do you go up your supply chain? The guidance is a bit unclear at the moment. It does seem to suggest that maybe you ought to be making sure people who supply you have got good procedures and policies in place. How are you going to do that? What kind of power do you have over them to make them to have any influence on what they might do? The other thing that I think most of us are familiar with, what happens on the ground somewhere may not at all be reflective of what you think is happening. That is quite difficult to manage. And lastly, we come to monitoring and review. As I said, there needs to be regular review. That will depend on the nature of your business. Steady state businesses where nothing is changing, maybe that's annually. But if you're an acquisitive business that's buying stuff all over the globe all the time, surely that review is going to have to be every time you look at a new market. Is this policy appropriate for that market? We're going to launch this new product. Is the way we've controlled and managed our bribery policies appropriate for the new product? So in which case, that review and the frequency of that review is going to have to be rather more often. And then, how are you actually going to do anything with that feedback? How are you going to feed it back into your policies and procedures that you started with? What is it you're actually going to do? Is there going to be somebody appointed within the business with that responsibility? We've looked at lots of companies' policies and procedures, and mainly they just stop after the audit. There's nothing that then takes those findings back and says, this is how we're going to change going forwards. We've noted these deficiencies. What are we going to do going forward? And I think that's quite a key part of it. So, what's the suggested approach? How do you go about putting in place in your business an adequate procedures framework? Well, I think the first part is you need to get the right people in the room. Okay? The people that drive the business who know where the risks are. And then you need to give them a chairman, the person who is going to provide that tone at the top. Do they need to be a main board member? Possibly, depends on the business. But they've certainly got to have the support of the main board behind it. You've got to be able to demonstrate that you've given it really credible authority in your organisation to make things happen and to make things change. The next step, and I think perhaps the most important one, is to conduct your risk assessment. What are the risks of your particular industry? Where do you do business? Who are you doing business with? Perhaps should you be doing business with those people? Quite a difficult question to ask yourself. We've looked at lots of businesses that rely on agents to facilitate their trade overseas. And all of them have reported that once they started looking at why they were using those agents, in a good 50% of cases they found they didn't need them. Once they started trying to understand what the business case was behind using that agent, they could get rid of them. It made more sense for them, it eliminated an extra person in the chain, but it's again an example of how the Bribery Act is changing people's way of doing business. It's actually influencing the mechanisms behind business as well as changing people's perception. Once you've conducted that risk assessment, it's about designing policies and procedures which are going to mitigate the risks you have identified. So not the ones that are just listed in transparency's schedule or the ones we read about in seminars, but the ones which are pertinent to your business. And then you have to develop the implementation program. How are you actually going to roll that out across the business? How are you going to record that you've done it? All those sorts of good things. Are you going to use external people? Are you going to do it internally? I would say this as a consultant, but if you use external people, it can confer a degree of independence and rigour when you're trying to explain what you've done. Conversely, if you use internal resource, you know your business best of all, you know the people, you know what's going to get them moving in the right direction. So there's pluses and minuses to both those approaches. And lastly, is it working? How are you going to develop a monitoring and review program? If the SFO knock on the door, which they might do, they're going to ask you some fairly serious questions. First of which is, can the board articulate what your policy is on bribery and corruption? Can they comfortably and without having to refer to the compliance department or look at their notes go, actually, yes, I do know what our policy is, it's this. And it's clearly articulated on this website, that intranet, that policy document. If you can do that, you're part of the way there. But then they're going to ask a few other difficult questions. Now, you've got this great policy that says we don't bribe people, and I've listened to what you say, and I'm convinced. So when did you last turn down a contract? When did you last turn down some business? None of us like to do that. But occasionally, if we've done this properly, there will be circumstances where we should have done. And we need to have documented it in those cases where we went, actually, we don't think we should do that business. And the SFO are going to be expecting you to say, well, here was an example where the policy worked. Here is where we identified something that was risky and we decided not to do it. Or perhaps an individual did do something you'd rather they didn't do, and here is the disciplinary action we took. Because I think if you haven't got anything that shows that the policy is actually being applied, it becomes a bit of a tick box, isn't it? You need something to demonstrate, actually, we apply this, we take it seriously, and as management we accept that sometimes that means we might lose a bit of business or lose a key member of staff, but that's beyond our policy. That's how you demonstrate it works. Lovely, lovely chart here. Transparency International, very good organisation for those of you that don't know it. It is the sort of authoritative body on corruption worldwide. It's a pressure group, has a number of august bodies on its board. This is the chart from their latest 2010 report, which I have here. Basically, what they do is they rank countries by the perceived corruption risk. And it's only public sector corruption risk, so it doesn't cover business to business like the Bribery Act does. So it has some failings, is what I'm sort of caveating this section with. However, I think it provides you with a very useful basis for looking at where you do business. Covers 178 countries, as it says. 10 means you are very clean. 0 means you are very corrupt. I don't think there's any country with 0, but I can be corrected on that. Least corrupt in first place is New Zealand, Denmark and Singapore. I don't know if any of you have read the stuff in the papers about New Zealand, so it isn't foolproof. Worst at the other end of the chain, we have places like Somalia and Iraq scoring sort of below 2. Below 4 as a score is regarded as endemic corruption. Where does the UK come? Does anyone know? Apart from Neil. It came 20th, which is not particularly good. Particularly not when we came 17th last year. So basically the UK is more corrupt this year than it was last year. So when we're thinking about the Bribery Act, you think there is some reasons behind why we need this sort of legislation. I know it's unfair, I know it's difficult, and I know it's hard to work with. But it does appear on the basis of this that there is a problem with the UK. Interestingly as well, though, the US deteriorated. It was 22nd this year, 19th last year. And it was picked out particularly by transparency because it had a drop of more than 0.3 on their index in a single year. They use that as one of the triggers for this is a particularly poorly performing country. And it's kind of interesting to note that those countries that were hit worse by the financial crisis seem to have performed very badly in the corruption perception index. So draw from that what you will. But we find this is quite useful in talking to clients about how do you do corruption risk assessments, because they can immediately see how they can translate it into a policy or a procedure. I want to do business in Iran. Well, it scores a number. Oh, I'm comfortable with a number, I can work with that. That means, because it's got a 2, so it's in my high risk category, I do the following. So it's a useful trigger point. People can understand it and get their head around it, and it gives them some assistance. But of course, geographical risk is not the only one. On the right-hand side, from where I'm standing, those are the sort of big picture bits of a corruption risk assessment, and perhaps a bit more granularity down this side. So the first one is the country presence that we've just looked at. Where are you doing business? Clearly, certain countries higher risk than others. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do business, it just means you have to do more in how you do that business. What are your operations? What kind of things are you doing in those territories? Clearly, some things are more risky than others. Extractive industries, obviously, case in point. One of the things, though, we find very interesting when we do a lot of these sort of investigations is it is not normally the core business operations that have the problem. Lots of people are out there busily putting in place controls and procedures around their business, and they're getting quite good at it, but they forget the head office. And you find that the building facilities management team in India have been busily bribing to get permits to build a building, and no one ever looked at it because it's not the core business. And we find that time and time again. Where the risks are, it's the marketing team. They flew everyone to South Africa to watch part of the World Cup and didn't think that was £20,000 a pop. And yet there were contracts coming through at the same time. But they'd never been taught anything about this because they're not part of the core business. So I think you have to be quite careful when you do these risk assessments to make sure in that steering group you've got the right people. You've got to make sure everyone who has potential is there. Obviously, the activities themselves, do you engage? Do you allow gifts? Some businesses do. Some businesses, because of this, have just said, no, we're not going to allow them, full stop. Drawn a line in the sand. Hospitality and travel, obviously key ones. One of the ones we're finding there that is causing people a lot of trouble is actually education. They're flying people in to teach them about how a system works, or to provide them some training on something to do with their business, but at the same time putting them up somewhere very nice, and because they're a client, giving them quite nice entertainment and hospitality and looking after them in the evening, as you would. But when you look at it and you look at what that training was about, it probably wasn't actually something that you needed to fly them into the UK, put them up in a 5-star hotel and look after them. So that's one where I think people are becoming slightly unstuck. Obviously, the use of third parties, agents. We had a very recent case where a German agent was helping out an insurance broker. No one was suspicious until he gave them their email address, which was the helping hand, which kind of slightly gave away what he did for his £250,000 a time. So that was quite an interesting little story. And obviously, certain areas have much higher government interaction than others. Certain countries, you will find that virtually all of the businesses you deal with will have someone from the state on the board or in relation to. That obviously increases your risk. I was going to touch on some of the issues that we're finding, but I know Neil wants to cover those in some detail. So just to run through them in very high levels, obviously corporate hospitality is an issue. What the level you set, does it change with public officials? Does it change in different areas? Is it okay to have the same limit in Indonesia and the UK? Facilitation payments. These are the small little payments you paid to get something done that you probably should have got done anyway. The $50 when you land at an airport. I would like to say this story to our partners. I got sent to Angola recently to do an investigation, and it's fine, you have a bodyguard and they look after you. The only place they can't go is back through departures. So they walk up to departures with you, you walk through departures, and at that point you're nabbed by the customs guys. They put you in a cell and they say, your yellow fever vaccination is out of date. You need to pay us $50 and we'll forego giving you this injection from a rusty needle, and on you go. So, do I pay? Technically, it's facilitation payment. If I pay it, I've committed the offence. In theory, Grant Thornton didn't have procedures in place to prevent me doing so. They've committed the offence. Well, I asked our partners what I should do, and they said, don't pay. Which didn't help me a lot. Anyway, in that particular scenario, I'm sure it would be regarded as extortion and fine. But it's where you pay the $50 every time you go into the country. And it's fine if it's maybe 1 or 2 people, but if you're putting 100,000 people through a point of entry and always paying that, then it's systemic, then perhaps it's not fine. M&A, lots of our clients are having a problem. They want to buy a business somewhere in the world. They know it's got problems. It's in Equatorial New Guinea. Do they buy it? If they do they run the risk of taking on its corrupt activities? Possibly. I'm sure Neil will pick up on that one a bit later. And I think the last one that you just can't afford to do is to ignore the act. You just can't. Doing nothing, well, technically I suppose you can. There's nothing in the act itself which says you have to do something, but if you haven't put in place anything and you have a problem, it's going to be a very uncomfortable session at Elm Street. Coming up to the end of my time, but I thought I'd just leave you with what Alex said on the subject. He always seems to capture the nub of the issues. So it all comes down to judgment, really, doesn't it? Anyway, with that, I will hand over to Martin.